We recommend this product be installed by a competent gunsmith.
Modification of your firearm may nullify the warranty of the firearm's manufacturer.
No liability is expressed or implied for damage or injury which may occur from improper use or installation of this product.
You are responsible for the safe handling, legalities, and use of your firearm.
Warning: always wear safety glasses when working on firearms. Hi guys, Scott Folk here from Apex Tactical Specialties. Today I'm going to walk you through the installation of our Action Enhancement Kit for Glock pistols. You'll notice that the installation is pretty similar for all the Gen 3, 4, 5, and the Slim Frame models of guns, so this video will cover all of those for you. For this installation, you're going to need a Glock Armorer's Punch or a 3/32 inch pin punch, and lubrication. Doesn't matter what variety, just use a Gun Grade Lubricant. Before we get started, I want to go over some quick differences between the Gen 4 frame and the Gen 5 frames. The Gen 4 frames have 2 pins going through the locking block. The Gen 5s only have the 1. That's no problem. When I go through this portion of the disassembly on the Gen 4s, just ignore that for your Gen 5. The other main difference you'll notice on the Gen 5 compared to the Gen 4 is the Gen 4 has the cruciform dropping down into the sear housing, whereas the Gen 5 has this little saddle it drops into. Again, we'll just change that up a little bit when we go to the Gen 5s, but other than that, the disassembly and reassembly are the same. So we're going to start by removing frame pins. I'll push the front locking block pin out, push that across, pull it out the back. I'll also push out the back sear housing pin. Again, push that guy through and pop it out. So now I need to pull out the trigger pivot pin. That one's a little more tricky because that actually locks in the slide lock lever. So what I have to do is I may need to pick up a little bit on the slide lock, pushing up from the inside and then grabbing the back to pull it down. And then I'm going to push through, try to get that to disengage. I'm going to wiggle the slide lock forward and back until the pin starts to move. Push that guy all the way through, and then that's been removed. With the frame pins removed, I can now remove the rest of the assembly. First I'll pull the trigger bar and the trigger up. That'll normally pull my locking block out. I'll pull that guy out, set it aside. Slide lock lever comes out as well, pull that aside. Then I can grab the ejector and pull up on it and pop the entire trigger assembly out of the frame. We're going to go ahead and take the trigger bar out of the sear assembly. So on the Gen 3 4, you just basically rotate the trigger body away, pull it out, and I rotate the spring toward the back. And then I'll disconnect the spring off the back of the trigger bar, like so. Once we have that out, we can proceed on. On the Gen 5s, it's very simple. Basically roll the trigger bar out, disconnect from the saddle, and you have it disconnected. There's no spring to worry about because the spring and everything are inside the saddle and don't need to be removed. Next, I need to remove the factory connector. So I'll turn the housing over. I'll take a look and you'll see the pinhole on the back there. All I have to do is press in there. So I'll hold the housing and I'll press that out with my pin punch to remove it. Let's go over a quick kit comparison for the Gen 3 4 kit compared to the parts that came out of the Gen 4 I just opened up. You'll see, of course, the factory trigger and trigger bar, factory connector, and factory striker plunger. The Apex parts, of course, we have our trigger that's labeled G34 for the Gen 3 and 4. The trigger bar we have installed on it. You'll also see the Apex connector with our name lasered on the side, as well as our fully polished and custom manufactured striker plunger. I wanted to go over the differences between the Gen 5 factory components and the Gen 5 Apex kit. You have, of course, the factory trigger and bar here and factory connector. The Apex connector, of course, has our name on it, and the trigger has G5 on it for Gen 5. You'll also notice that for the slim frames, it has LSSF. That's for the slim frame or large frame, depending on which kit it's going to go into, but you'll see those labeled that way. In this case, I only have the Gen 5 kit to show you. The installation on the Gen 5 is the same for the slim frame as well. With the factory connector removed, we're ready to install our connector. Very straightforward. Pick it up, put it into the slot, and press it all the way down. I make sure it's sitting sub-flush right here at the very end. It is supposed to spring up here on the end, so don't worry about that when you install it. Next thing we need to do is reassemble the trigger bar onto the sear housing, but first I'm going to lubricate it. You need to put grease or oil right here on the connector. That is the most critical point of lubrication on a Glock. The factory recommends it in their manual, and so do we. So once that's lubricated, I'll hang on to the trigger return spring here. I'll hook it into the trigger bar, just kind of fish it around until it goes into the notch. Once I have it in the notch, I can put a little stretch on that spring, roll it around, and carry it into the housing. I'll take the trigger bar, drop it down, and lock it into the housing, and now you can see the trigger bar is sitting where it's supposed to. When I let go, it'll kind of pop off, and that's fine. We'll finally assemble that into the frame in a minute. Just like the Gen 3 4, we're going to lubricate the trigger connector location, so I'll put some oil right there to make sure it's well lubricated. And what I'm going to do, I'll take the trigger bar, and I just need to set the front of the trigger bar into the saddle inside the sear housing, roll it in position, and make sure I've got it there, and we're good to go. This is how the saddle should look with the trigger bar installed in it. The trigger bar is inside the saddle. That's where you want it. Now we're ready to reinstall the trigger assembly into the frame. Pretty straightforward. Take the assembled trigger mechanism, drop the trigger body in through the trigger mortise, set the housing in the back, and just slide it all the way down. I'll take the smooth pin that goes in the rear, I'll put that through the housing. That should go all the way in. I'll use the side of my punch to press it in so I don't damage the hole in my frame. Otherwise, if you push it in and you miss, you'll damage the frame. So I go sideways to press it in, make sure it's just below flush. In this case, I'll also put the locking block in right on top. Pretty straightforward move here. We just slide it in, slide it all the way down. On the Gen 3.4s, you're gonna wanna put the locking block front top pin in first. I'll put that guy in now, push it all the way down, and again, I'll use my pin sideways and just press it in to make sure it's in position. The idea with this is to make sure it's there. Now we can put the slide lock lever in and tension it properly. With the first two frame pins pre-installed, I'll go ahead and put the slide lock lever in position. I keep the top pin in, but the bottom pin out, so it allows me some proper tension. I'll slide the slide lock lever in to the gap between the trigger body and the frame. I'll push it forward, and I need to make sure that the spring here stays underneath that pin. Not above it, not around it, right where it's at, below that steel pin. What we'll do now is from the right side, I'll take the trigger pivot pin and I'll put it in, and I'll come in and I'll capture the trigger body and make sure the trigger body is pivoting on that pin. In this case it is. Then I'll push further across, and then I'll line up the slide lock lever. So with the trigger pivot pin partially installed, I'm gonna take the slide lock lever, I'm gonna push it forward. You can see it's interrupting the hole, so I need to kind of carry it up a little bit as I put it in position. And as I go, I'm gonna press this pivot pin in from the back side, and I just happen to get it perfect this time. I'll push that in until it kind of clicks in place. I could almost hear the click just now. Sometimes it will or won't click in. But if you give a little bit of a push from either side, you'll see that it's in position. The Gen 5 is a little bit different, so I want to go over that separately. I'll take the rear pin like we did before, push it in, put it in position. I'll use my pin sideways to make sure I don't damage the frame. From here, I'll take the slide lock levers, drop them in on top of the trigger bar and the trigger body, and this kind of fall right in. It shouldn't take much force to put it in there. The locking block will go on top, press that guy down, and that's in position. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my trigger pivot pin, I'm gonna put that in, and that'll start capturing the slide lock lever, but then I have to position the trigger body for it to match up. If you take a look inside the trigger pivot pin hole from the opposite side, you'll see the trigger body interferes with the hole. So I'll put a little pressure on that pin, and I'll move the trigger body around until I get my clearance, and I'll keep kind of pushing that pin and kind of twisting it and wiggling the trigger body, and you can see it, there we go, kind of coming through. Once it's there, a little bit more wiggling and movement, and it'll push through. I'll go to the other side, and I'll make sure I have it just pressed where it's kind of locks in position, and it should be roughly equal on both sides. To replace the striker plunger, we need to remove the back plate first. So first we need to go in here between the striker face itself and the stripper rail and find the little plastic sleeve that is the housing around the striker. I'll press down against spring tension, put my thumb all the way over the top, and slide the back plate off. That little pop you heard was the extractor spring popping up. That's normal. Keep your thumb over the top so you don't lose that. I'll put my thumb back over the top and slide the back plate off. The next one you hear is the striker sleeve popping up against my hand. With those detensioned, I can remove the components as needed. To remove the striker plunger, I need to take the extractor out of the way. First, I need to remove the extractor spring. So I'll pull the extractor spring and plunger back, giving me space to push the extractor out. I'll come in here and I'll press on the striker plunger. I'll press that guy down, and I'll go ahead and pull the extractor into the breech and let it fall out. We'll put that back in later. I'll go ahead and put my finger in here and hold the striker plunger down, and I'll pull the striker out, about an inch or so to get it out of the way. Now I can relieve tension on the striker plunger, and now I can remove it from the slide as needed to replace it. I want to show you the differences between the factory component and the Apex striker plunger. You'll see the factory component has kind of a bevel on the end. It's kind of a dull finish. The Apex striker plunger has a nice radius surface on the end and is also very well polished. This is intentional to give you a nice smooth uptake and trigger pull. To install the Apex striker plunger, we'll take the factory spring, we'll push it into the striker plunger. Sometimes it'll click in place, sometimes it won't. It's not really critical if it does or not. Take the slide, drop the plunger into the slide, make sure that spring gets where it needs to go. I'll press it all the way up and hold it in position. I'll take the extractor, I'll set it over the top, and I'll put it in position. Now I can let go of tension on the striker plunger and it'll hold itself in place. Now we can put the rest of the components back together. With the striker plunger in position and the extractor reset holding it in place, all we need to do now is push the striker all the way in against the striker plunger and make sure the extractor plunger is seated against the extractor. Now we can put the back plate back on. To reinstall the back plate, all I'll do is take the back plate, put it against the slide, and I'll hold it with my thumb just in position. I'll press on the striker sleeve under spring tension, press that guy down until I can get the back plate over it. That'll hold the striker in place. Now I have to compress the extractor spring while I push the back plate up. Once I'm there, I can pull my punch out and lock the back plate in place. Now that we have the striker plunger installed, we're going to go ahead and do a functions check. I'll pull back on the striker just a little bit, take tension off. Make sure the striker plunger moves up and down smoothly. I'll press it in, I'll let the striker forward, and I'll actually press it forward. And I want to see that the striker is going through the breech. This verifies that I'm actually able to fire it. I'll release it, pull it back, striker plunger should pop up. If I push forward, I get no movement of the striker going forward, which is proper operation. One thing I want to show you is something we get questions about all the time. With the Glock system, unless you have a striker on it and pressing forward on the trigger bar, you're not going to have a functional trigger. In this case, the trigger does not return forward. If I press forward on the trigger bar and engage it, and I hit the safety, it doesn't fire. It can't be pulled until you relieve tension by pushing the trigger bar forward and then compressing the safety. This is normal for the Glocks, so don't think that your gun is not functioning properly. Put the slide on and test it in the fashion we do in a minute. Now we're going to do a function check on the Glock. Keep in mind, all Glocks have the same function, and function check works across the board on every Glock model and generation. First, I'll press on the trigger body without the safety to make sure it doesn't fire. It does not. I'll put my finger on the safety, press the trigger, I get a dry fire. I'll cycle the slide. I'll release slowly to reset. I'll re-engage, and it dry fires. I'll let my finger off the trigger entirely, reset the slide, goes back into battery, press the trigger and safety properly, and this is proper operation. As you can see, the installation of our Gen 3, 4, and Gen 5 and Slim Frame kits are pretty straightforward. The one thing I want you to walk away with from this is to make sure you lubricate your pistols. It's got to function properly, and to make it function properly, it's got to be lubricated. Keep in mind that if you have any questions or problems, contact Apex customer support. That's what they're here for.